Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're tuning in today because we are going to unpack a really massive, genuinely fascinating piece of history. We're looking at India's incredible socio-economic development, starting right from a deeply rooted crisis in 1947, just after independence, all the way through to a monumental economic pivot in 1991. It's a journey full of changing ideologies, sheer survival, and massive structural shifts, and we're going to break the whole shebang down step by step.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the 1947 economic crisis, choosing the socialist path, reforming the land, the Green Revolution, the rise of heavy industries, and finally, the 1991 liberalization shift. Basically, we're covering the ideology, the farms, the factories, and the future.
So starting right off with Section 1, the 1947 economic crisis.
Imagine it's 1947. India achieves independence, but the new government inherits a systemic crisis of just epic proportions. To truly grasp the scale of it, think about this number. A staggering 80% of the Indian population relied directly on agriculture for their livelihood back then. I mean, when 8 out of 10 people are tied to just one sector, any inefficiency there doesn't just affect the economy, right? It literally dictates the survival of the entire nation. And unfortunately, this sector was severely broken.
The root causes here were really compounding. It was like a perfect storm. Under British rule, traditional cottage and artisanal industries were pretty much ruined, which forced masses of previously skilled artisans to fall back on farming. This created massive overcrowding on the land, leading to what economists call disguised unemployment. Essentially, you had more people working a piece of land than were actually necessary, so they weren't producing any extra yield. Add to this the zamindari system, where powerful landlords ruthlessly exploited tenant farmers and extracted huge rents. The result? Deep, systemic poverty, incredibly low per capita income, and crippling rural debt.
Which brings us to Section 2, choosing the socialist path.
To fix an economy trapped in that level of poverty, the government had to pick a completely new ideological direction. They faced a critical crossroads. On one hand, the capitalist path, relying on free market operations. On the other, the socialist path, driven heavily by state intervention. India ended up choosing a middle ground, the Nehruvian socialist path. This was designed to minimize exploitation and deliver social justice. Inspired partly by the rapid industrialization they were seeing in the Soviet Union at the time, this approach meant the state would play a highly active role in pushing both economic growth and widespread equality.
Moving right along to Section 3, reforming the land.
With that new ideology in place, the government turned to its most pressing battleground, the rural economy. This is where the legislative fight to redistribute wealth truly kicked off. By 1956, the Zamindari Abolition Acts were passed, dismantling that old landlord system. This was a massive undertaking. Overnight, 3 million tenant farmers became the rightful owners of 6.2 million hectares of land. The government also introduced land ceiling acts to cap how much land any one person could own, with the hope of distributing the surplus to landless people. But, actually, it wasn't a total success. While it definitely empowered farmers politically, major loopholes allowed powerful landlords to evict tenants and keep vast estates just by claiming it was for personal cultivation.
But you know, the push for land reform wasn't just happening in stuffy government offices. It was happening on foot, all across the country. Take a look at Vinoba Bhave. He's a remarkable figure who really humanized this massive historical shift. While the government was using laws and acts, Bhave launched the Bhudan, or land gift movement. He literally traveled the country, appealing directly to large landowners to voluntarily donate their surplus land to the landless. It was this fascinating parallel effort, using moral persuasion alongside state policy to tackle deeply entrenched inequalities.
Which leads us to Section 4, the Green Revolution.
So, despite those early land reforms, by the 1960s, food production was still dangerously low. A starving nation meant the strategy had to evolve, fast. Now, what's really interesting here is the total paradigm shift that followed. Starting around 1965, the government introduced high-yielding varieties, or HYV seeds, particularly for wheat and rice. But these quote-unquote miracle seeds couldn't work all on their own. They required modern tech, tractors, heavy irrigation, chemical fertilizers, and pesticides. This technological leap transformed traditional farming into a highly modern, intensive operation, what we now know as the Green Revolution.
And the results? Absolutely staggering. To put it into perspective, rice production leaped from 35 million tons in 1960 to an incredible 104 million tons by 2011. Wheat saw a similar dramatic jump, going from 11 million to 94 million tons.
Within just a couple of decades, India had actually achieved food self-sufficiency. Though we should note, this success did come at a cost. The heavy reliance on chemical fertilizers and pesticides eventually led to severe ecological damage in certain regions, which actually explains the modern resurgence we're seeing today in organic farming. Over the decades, the government's approach to fighting rural poverty kept evolving. In 1980, they launched the IRDP across over 5,000 blocks to provide capital assets, like livestock, to the poor. By 1999, recognizing a few implementation flaws, they restructured it to heavily promote self-employment. And then, in 2005, came a monumental shift, MGNREGA. This act guaranteed 100 days of paid wage employment per year to any rural household willing to do manual labor. It fundamentally changed the bargaining power of rural workers for good.
All right, moving to Section 5, the rise of heavy industries.
To truly understand India's transformation, we have to pivot completely from the agrarian fields to the creation of an industrial backbone. Let's look at how this builds upon that Nehruvian socialist ideology we talked about earlier. The state took on the massive responsibility of building heavy industries because, frankly, the private sector just didn't have the capital or the desire for projects that took years to yield returns. With international help from countries like the UK, Germany, and the USSR, India built colossal state-owned enterprises like the Bokaro steel plant and heavy engineering turbines from BHEL in underdeveloped regions to drive regional equality and achieve self-reliance.
To show you just how aggressive this state-led industrialization was, check out this number. In 1951, India had exactly 5 public sector units, or PSUs. By 2012, fueled by the government's highly structured 5-year plans, that number exploded to 225. Capital investment grew massively from 29 crore rupees to over 7.3 lakh crore rupees. That is an astronomical leap in state funding. The state was heavily steering the economy, producing literally everything from steel to televisions.
And finally, Section 6, the 1991 liberalization shift.
As is often the case in history, long-standing policies eventually hit a breaking point. By 1991, many of those 225 public sector units we just talked about were in deep, deep trouble. They were plagued by massive financial losses, severe construction delays, and huge overstaffing. The state simply couldn't sustain it anymore. Forced by this crisis, the 1991 industrial policy completely dismantled decades of strict licensing and state control. The government began deregulating markets, rolling back its ownership through disinvestment, and opening its doors wide to foreign direct investment. It was a massive, sweeping pivot from a state-controlled socialist model straight into a liberalized, globalized free market.
Now, this brings us to a really sobering realization. There is absolutely no denying that the 1991 liberalization brought unprecedented prosperity, access to consumer goods, and a rapidly booming middle class. But as wealth grew, so did the wage gap. The divide between top executives and formal sector workers, compared to those working in the informal, unorganized sectors, expanded significantly. So it leaves us with this final provocative thought. Did the great shift to liberalization truly solve the foundational economic problems of 1947, or did it simply trade those old struggles for complex new inequalities? Something to think about. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today. Keep questioning and keep learning.